Hey everybody, this is my second excerpt from my new book, A Christian Case Against Donald Trump, which is available on Amazon, and I linked to that book below. Now, this video is important to me. It's another part of the prologue of the book, and it's the most complete version that I've written about my life before I became a guy who opposes Donald Trump on the internet. I hope it answers a lot of questions that I get about where I'm coming from. It's a longer excerpt than most of them are going to be, so here we go. I'll just start reading it. As a pastor, I never talked about politics in church, and I barely followed the news. It's not that I didn't care. Far from it. It's because I used to care too much. Before I entered pastoral ministry, I'd been quite active in the pro-life movement. I spoke in churches and public schools on behalf of the unborn, and I volunteered to help elect pro-life candidates. And in those years, I saw the Republican Party as an ally in fighting for the sanctity of human life. And coming from a conservative Republican family, the marriage between my pro-life convictions and the GOP felt like a natural fit. I grew up in rural Minnesota. My parents were public school teachers, farmers, and devout Catholics. So in Minnesota in the 1970s, those three identities usually meant that a person would vote for the Democrats, for the DFL party. But my parents had their own ideas. They followed their convictions to the Republican Party, and I followed along. I don't want to oversell my conservative leanings as a lad. After all, I was reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in elementary school, not William F. Buckley. But I did have a poster of Richard Nixon on my wall in second grade, and I did wish that they'd all just leave him alone about the Watergate stuff. But the abortion issue, far more than my parents' Republican leanings, drove my early political beliefs. I believed at a young age that unborn babies deserved the protection of law. I saw it as an issue of justice and basic human rights long before I could have expressed it in those terms. I studied the issue in more depth during my high school years. While other kids were doing normal things like their assigned homework, I worked on developing a consistent human life ethic that could guide my future political involvement. And I landed on some positions regarding the sanctity of human life back then that I still hold to this day. While I'm no longer convinced that the realm of law and politics are going to solve our divisions regarding abortion, I still believe the unborn child is a human being. I still want desperately to do my part to foster a culture of respect for human life in our nation. And I also developed some other pro-life views in high school that I still hold to this day. For instance, I still oppose capital punishment. Not because I think it's unwarranted in some cases or unbiblical, but because I'm skeptical that our system of justice can be trusted to enforce it in a fair manner. And I've always favored, from my earliest memory, some common sense form of what we used to call gun control. I grew up in an extended family of sportsmen and NRA members, and I had unfettered access to a small arsenal of hunting rifles and shotguns and pistols from the time I was old enough to enroll in a gun safety class. And I still think it's insane that our political system can't find a way to protect the ownership of those sorts of weapons while banning the ones that enable an untrained teenager to hold dozens of police officers at bay. As you've undoubtedly noticed, those issues don't sit well together in the platforms of either of our major political parties in America. So I found it difficult from the start to align my consistent pro-life ethic with support for one political party over the other. Even back then, they were drawing the battle lines in ways that just made little sense from my perspective. In recent years, I've come to see that I ignored or explained away whole sets of additional issues that I'd now place under the banner of pro-life. But in 1984, the anti-abortion issue carried the most weight in my thinking. So I cast my first presidential vote for Ronald Reagan, who spoke directly to that concern. And because I agreed with him on the sanctity of life, I found it easier to buy the rest of the package. And by casting that first vote and participating in Reagan's landslide victory over Minnesota's own Walter Mondale, I solidified my personal attachment to the GOP. Over the next several years, I married Jane, my high school girlfriend. I started a family, and I grew deeper in my faith, and my pro-life convictions grew as well. But even though I was raised a Catholic, I didn't link my views on the sanctity of life as tightly to my faith as you might imagine. In fact, I remember arguing once with some friends who said that my pro-life convictions were simply a way of pushing my faith onto others. But I insisted that my religious beliefs had nothing to do with my concern for human life. And whether that was entirely true or not, I believed it when I said it. I didn't start linking my pro-life sensibilities to my faith in a conscious way until January 1989, when I attended a service at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis on Pro-Life Sunday. Pastor John Piper delivered the best biblical defense that day that I'd heard for the sanctity of human life. I started attending his church because that message resonated with me, and I eventually joined the church and began to identify as an evangelical. But I don't blame my involvement at that church for the narrow and strident political person I became during the next few years. In fact, I think the preaching I heard at Bethlehem kept me from going off the rails, and it provided a framework for the much healthier approach I developed later on. I think my time at Bethlehem prepared me years in advance to say no to Donald Trump when he arrived on the scene. I respected the fact that Pastor Piper cared deeply about the sanctity of life, and he spoke about it and took personal actions to lift that value in the world. But he modeled a careful approach to preaching that kept the ultimate focus on God and God's kingdom. I took his preaching as a warning against the idolatry of placing our hope in some ideal Christian kingdom on this earth. He called us to live and to speak prophetically within the culture, but not so we could seize the levers of earthly power. He challenged us to live sacrificially, to faithfully display the values of another kingdom. And I bring this up because I want people to know that this sort of teaching can be done and done well. My 6 years at Bethlehem gave me a model for how believers can work passionately for justice in this world without placing our hope in building an earthly kingdom through political means. But that's not to say I was the best listener in those years. Despite the warnings that I'd heard about attaching too much hope to my political involvement, I still managed to get deeply entrenched in what I now see as a right-wing echo chamber. During a stint as a courier driver, I got in the habit of listening to people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity on the radio, and I started getting my written news from some of the early online message boards. And these sites fed me article after article from a conservative perspective, and I read nothing to counter those arguments. So by the time I entered pastoral ministry, I'd become deeply committed to the conservative movement and emotionally invested in the success of the Republican Party. And I was giving huge amounts of emotional and intellectual energy to people who made their living just stirring up my anger for profit. I'm ashamed to admit how much of that scene I bought into. But by God's grace, when I became a pastor, I did recognize early on that I had to lay down my political involvement. It's not that I immediately saw how distorted my thinking had become. I simply realized I couldn't serve two masters. If I brought my partisanship to the pulpit, it would endanger my call to serve the flock that Jesus had entrusted to my care. The most serious alarms went off in my spirit when I found that my political views were affecting how I saw the people in my congregation. I knew that this just couldn't be right. It simply had to be wrong to find myself judging the people that I'd been called to serve simply because they came to different conclusions about politics. So I made a conscious choice back then to put my political views aside. But that proved to be more difficult than I thought. Given the deep partisan hole that I dug for myself, I found the only way to climb out was to stop following politics altogether. So I entered what became a nearly 20-year self-imposed exile from the daily news cycle. And that 2-decade fast from politics worked wonders in my life. It detoxified my soul from the poisons that I'd been taking in for so long. By the time I retired from ministry in 2016, I'd spent years focusing on the kingdom of God without the added layer of distortions that I'd been getting from conservative media. So it's no surprise that when I started paying attention to politics again, I took a hard pass on Donald Trump. But other than Trump, I still voted a straight Republican ticket in 2016, back in the before times. I was only starting to dip my toes back into politics, and I didn't realize how the pro-life movement was being manipulated to keep people like myself on a team that no longer suited us. So I voted third party for president that year, 2016, rather than voting for the pro-choice candidate Hillary Clinton. I assumed most Christians agreed with me about Trump. I was naive back then. That was 2016, the last year of the before times, the year when everything changed for so many of us. In 2016, my naivete died. I'd kept it alive for 50 years. A good run by anyone's standards. It died hard, a long, drawn-out, painful awakening. But I do still have hope. And hope is far more useful than naivete. I've been promised that hope doesn't disappoint. All right, so that's today's excerpt from my book, A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. I'd love it if you'd help me spread the word about the book and about these videos on Facebook or wherever you hang out. I'm just kind of a one-person operation here, so the only way to get the word out is if people tell their friends and family about it. I'm putting a link to the Amazon page down below, along with my contact information for any influencers who'd like to talk to me about the project. I'd love to talk to you. So tomorrow, I'll be sharing a video on the fallacy of the lesser of two evils. It's one of the most common objections I get to the ideas I'm sharing on this channel, the lesser of two evils. So I'm going to share a section from the book about that. So as always, thanks for listening.